Hey, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy Good Friday for those who celebrate. Really excited for this conversation on building trust in our telecom network, something we've lost over the years with robocalling. Alex from YouMail, how are you?
Good, good. Thanks for having me on your show, Evan.
Well, thanks for being here and really a fascinating discussion, not just as a consumer. We've all seen the scourge of robocalls, but also from an enterprise and business perspective. Before we dive in, maybe introduce yourself and your mission at YouMail.
Sure. So I'm Alex Felici. I'm the CEO of YouMail. Our mission at YouMail is to make communicating on the legacy telephone network safe again. And specifically, we try to protect consumers from all of the scam and spam calls and texts that hit them. We try to help carriers stop originating that, find the customers that are putting all that garbage onto the network and causing problems.
Well, you make it sound so straightforward and simple, but of course, there's a lot to that. What was the big idea when you first got started? We've all seen the rise of robocalling over the last number of years, but what tell us about how you originally went to market?
So what's really interesting is Gmail used to be a voicemail company, and it had a number of
Hmm.
neat features. One of which was you could play an out of service greeting to particular numbers. So originally that was designed for, the stalkers or the people you met in a bar and you might not want to talk to anymore. But what we discovered over time is the main use case was blocking at the time 800 numbers. And so we realized you don't have a stalker calling you on a toll-free number. That's a company. That's a robocall or an automated call of some kind. And we realized that our users really wanted protection. They didn't just want to play the out of service greeting. They wanted those calls to be blocked. They wanted us to do it so they didn't have to maintain a list themselves. And that's how we sort of accidentally wandered in the space. We realized that because we were a voicemail service, we had huge amounts of audio left by bad guys. And so we built some technology that, given that audio, could detect when phone numbers were misbehaving and block them. That's how we got into this in the first place. It wasn't kind of a big focus at the start. It was an accidental mission, but where we realized there's a really important problem we can contribute to solving.
Well, a very happy problem that you're trying to solve, and talk about both. Maybe start with the end user. You do have an app for everyone. What is the user experience you provide there? How does that work for anyone and everyone who's on an app store?
So there's the YouMail app. And so that's a free app you can download. And it basically maintains a list of known spam numbers and blocks them. We also
Mhm.
replace your voicemail so we can label all the voicemails that spammers leave. So you can know instantly this is a scam versus it really potentially is your bank and there's something you've got to deal with. So that's a free service. We also have a paid service that blocks everything. It essentially puts a CAPTCHA in the way of callers getting through to you who aren't known. And so that guarantees you're not going to get any automated calls. But that's the core of the consumer business. It's look, we want to have fewer calls hit you. We want fewer voicemails hit you. And in fact, we block texts or warn you about texts depending on if you're on iOS or Android. So we want to really be an app that you can download and you're communicating much more safely. We're doing what we can to stop the scams and spam from hitting you. And really importantly, it's not just stuff that's, calling millions and millions of calls. There's lots of scams that call a list of 100,000 people or 50,000 people. We do our best to protect against those too.
Well, that sounds like a no-brainer. I'm going to be downloading that app after this chat, for me personally. But what about the enterprise, the business side, B2B? How do you support those consumer-facing enterprises or contact centers that have, this is, more than pain. It's real bottom dollars lost, opportunities lost.
Absolutely. So the biggest problem that enterprises face right now is brand impersonation. You're a large financial
Mm.
institution and there are bad guys out there. In fact, the bad guys are making more calls and sending more texts to people than you are. And they're pretending to be, the bank. They're pretending to be the payment transfer, all that stuff. And so what we do is we see those calls and texts coming in and hitting our user base. Our user base acts like a giant sensor network finding that stuff.
Mm.
Once we see it, we can figure out where it's come from, either directly or with partnerships, and then go to those carriers and say, you're putting this on the network or you're letting these illegal calls transit your network, shut them off. And they do. And so that's how we're helping the large enterprises is we're detecting the fraud, we're figuring out where the fraud comes, and we're working to take down that fraud, whether it's calls or texts. And so that's a big contributor where with at least some financial institutions, we've lowered the fraud 90% from where it was. And that's really meaningful when you're talking about scams that are $1,000, $2,000, $10,000, $100,000 a time in losses to consumers.
Wow, that's extraordinary. And as someone who's worked with carriers my whole career, what are the challenges, roadblocks, success stories you have in collaborating with carriers? I mean, how does that work behind the scenes exactly?
So we have a service that we sell to the carriers called Watch. And what Watch basically does is take all the phone numbers the carrier gives out and looks at what's the behavior from those phone numbers and the YouMail user base. Are they doing anything illegal? Once we see there's something illegal from a phone number that belongs to a carrier, the carrier gets notified and then can take action. So that's a pretty simple service, pretty easy to get started. It can also work with the CDRs if they want, if they're like a transit carrier. But that's a way where they can actually measure how much fraud is coming through their network and get rid of it. So I think when carriers see how easy it is to use, and if they're generally a clean carrier, they're trying to do their best to minimize this stuff, it's great. They work with us. It works really well. And so that's where we put our focus. But we also work with carriers. We just, our banking partners we'll see fraud. We'll just tell the carrier, here's some fraud. You should get rid of it. And the carriers generally do get rid of that stuff because who wants to be known for originating imposter scams, right? That's not helpful to anybody.
Yeah, to say the least. And when this really peaked as a obvious problem, the FCC and other government agencies got involved pretty aggressively, and yet best efforts weren't enough. Like, I thought this problem would have somehow just been solved some years ago, but that's not happening. What's your take?
Well, so my take is that there's been progress. If you look 4 or 5 years ago, I think 2019 in the fall, we were approaching 6 billion robocalls, of which 2 billion I would say are mostly wanted. They were like the real payment reminder from the bank or your doctor's reminder, things you care about, you want to get. And 4 billion were trashy, right? Stuff you don't want, telemarketers, spammers, scammers. If you look at where the world is now, we're getting 4 billion-ish robocalls. So it's down a third overall, but the bad stuff is down by at least half. And more importantly, the pure scams that were 2 billion, 2.5 billion a month, they're down to 300 million, 400 million, 500 million. They're down 80%. So there has been real progress here. But it's in part because the bad guys got better at what they do. It used to be a bad guy could call 100 million phone numbers, right? Make up phone numbers, call people, get through, bother everybody. The FCC and others have been really good with enforcement at stopping those really large scale campaigns. But the bad guys didn't go, well, I'm going to go work at Starbucks. What they did instead is they said, I'm going to target who I go after. So I'm not going to call 100 million people trying to find a particular bank's customers. I'm going to find data on the dark web with customer lists from breaches, and I'm going to call those exact customers. And I'm going to pretend to be the bank with data on those exact customers, and I'm going to get really, really efficient. So I don't make 100 million calls, I make 1 million calls, or I make 100,000 calls, and I do just as much, if not more damage. So it's been great that the kind of the nuisance stuff is going down, and it really is going down. The nefarious stuff is going down in volume, but not in terms of negative impact. So that's the big push now is protect people. And one of the things that's happened is you get fewer robocalls. You might actually just answer a call. Well, I haven't gotten a robocall for a while. I'm going to pick it up. That's the scammer getting through. Or take live voicemail. Live voicemail is a scammer's best friend. The scammer calls. They just start their automated message saying that there's a $1,200 iPhone on Amazon. You need to press 1 to fix the transaction. Sure enough, people do. And so there's things that have been done that have actually made them more efficient. So they don't need to call a ton of people. They can focus on a narrower niche or have just more effective calls for the ones they make.
I can't even imagine what happens when you start introducing deepfake voice kind of AI scams into this mix, how diabolical that becomes.
Well, it's already happened. And so one of the biggest
Wow.
ones
Okay.
was the fake Joe Biden in New Hampshire, where
Mm,
somebody called, I believe it was actually an operative for one of the political parties, called
mm,
to try to get people to not go to the polls, right? And say, oh, you don't need to vote now. There's no point. I think it was for one of the Democratic candidates, not Joe Biden, was ultimately responsible for this or their agency. And that caused a bunch of people to, not go to the polls. They got the calls and answered them. Okay, I guess I don't need to do stuff. And it sounded like Joe Biden, right? And so there are already deep fakes out there that are already causing problems. That's one at scale. You can imagine, that stuff's going to go on before the election all over the place. There's lots of the grandpa scam, like grandpa, I'm in jail, but now they can do a
mm.
deep fake voice. And again, your voicemail greeting, all of us have a voicemail greeting. Hey, I'm Alex, da 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 da. That's good enough to make a voice clone. So
Wow.
all a bad guy has to do now is call somebody, get their greeting, and now they can spoof that number and call other people. They're going to sound like them. So it's very, very easy now for this AI scams to take off. And I think we're just seeing the tip of what's going to be a very large iceberg.
Wow, that's unfortunate. So how do you, stay ahead of the game here in terms of the technology and the data science and the approach? I mean, how are you innovating in call protection at YouMail against these, what you just showed there, very sophisticated scam and robocall tactics?
So one of the critical things is data. So you need to have a lot of data to see what's actually happening. And then we apply all sorts of different techniques to that data, depending on the specific problem we're trying to solve. Like, how do you find the imposter calls that are out there? And then how do you figure out where they're coming from? And how do you try to get that cycle of shutting them down very quickly going as fast as possible? We just spend a lot of blocking and tackling doing that. And we combine it
Mm,
with a bigger vision. Like our vision is the only way that everybody's going to be made, kept safe is things are going to have, technology is going to have to monitor conversations. They're monitoring your text conversations, monitoring your voice
wow.
conversations in an automated way, solely to look for triggers for illegal behavior, right? You see a conversation that is very similar to ones that are known scammer conversations that have been recorded, the same sort of set of questions they ask, the same sort of things they do, like gift cards or, I'm in jail, those kind of things. You can actually start recognizing in real time, hey, this is an attack, and shut it off. And I think that's where we need to get to, but it's going to take a while to get there. But the bad guys are super motivated. And if the good guys aren't trying to fight them, it's going to be a big mess.
It sounds like it. So you published something called the Robocall Index. Tell us about the insights that you're able to get out of that and, how that influences your direction and strategies with customers.
So the Robocall Index is basically an estimate of the number of robocalls that are happening in the US or various regions in the US and what type of calls those are. That whole thing started because we wanted to understand the size of the problem. And we noticed that if we took our base as effectively a statistical sample, we could estimate what's going on in the country as a whole. And so that gave us a number at the time. It was 2 billion robocalls or something. We thought that was
Mm,
crazy. And we watched it growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And that was a really good indication that this problem was getting out of hand. And the great thing is it influenced policymakers, it influenced enforcement. It made everybody see we need to do something to turn the tide. And so for us, it's a progress measure. It's what's actually going on. Are we making progress in the fight? And then it's a way to see some details. Hey, scams are really going down. And that's great in terms of volume of calls. But then the FTC is showing that the dollar losses are going up. So that means the scammers are getting better. We got more work to do. So we just view it as data for everybody to see how are we doing? What's the biggest problem to focus on? What do we do next? What's worked? What isn't working? Just a nice tool, and just nobody had measured it before we did.
hold on. And so looking forward, what are some of the challenges that you'll be helping address, maybe opportunities? Are you outside the US? Are you supporting customers beyond our borders?
We do. We actually bought a small company in the UK a little while ago that had their own
Mm,
voicemail service, their own second line service, and that's been a great source of data of what's going on in the UK, getting us started there. And so you're going to see us start rolling out with partners in different places. So, We want to help everywhere. The US is now probably not the worst per capita robocall problem in the world. You look at
Oh,
Brazil,
wow.
you look at Spain, there's plenty of places that have huge volumes of scam calls and texts. And so, there's no reason we should only be in the US. It was a great place to get started, but our technology works everywhere. The biggest challenge is just getting basic consumers using us so we're collecting the really valuable data that enables us to go work with carriers to shut things down and block phone numbers for consumers.
Well done. So we're, in the busy season out there, lots of events, meetups, trade shows. What are you looking forward to the next few months? Any travel personally, professionally,
Well,
Mark?
my wife is from Hawaii, so I'm forced to go to Hawaii frequently for
Oh,
family, which,
that's a tough one. Yeah.
that's a tough one. But I am looking forward to ITW in Washington, D.C. in May. That's where all the
Hmm.
carriers go. And that's a really great opportunity for the carriers and us to get together and see what we can do for them. The great thing is that we can basically, our data can allow us to look at any carrier and say, well, here's what's on your network. And we can just pull up a laptop and show them. And
Wow.
that's pretty motivating for folks to say, maybe I should work with YouMail and do something here. It looks, or, hey, I'm really clean. And we're like, yep, you're really clean. You don't need us. Great news.
Yeah, it's a great event, great opportunity. I forgot that was just around the corner. So, yeah, maybe I'll be there. Look forward to catching up on the news and all the insights. And congratulations on your success helping so many people and customers with this challenge. Thanks, Alex. Have a great weekend and holiday.
Thank you, Evan. It's great being on your show.
Likewise. Take care, everyone. And check out YouMail. I will actually after this call. Okay.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye.